Why did the laughter sting more than the bullets themselves? Private Nicole Harper stood at the firing line, the Wyoming wind tugging at her fatigues, the weight of an M4 carbine steady in her hands. Her breath was calm, her movements unremarkable, but the moment the first shot cracked, the valley echoed with derision. The paper target downrange stayed untouched. Nothing, not a mark. By the second shot, someone behind the safety barrier snorted loud enough for half the company to hear. By the third, even her own logistics section shifted uncomfortably. By the fourth, the colonel's smirk had hardened into confirmation of everything he already believed about people like her. And by the fifth shot, the sound wasn't gunfire that lingered in the air, it was laughter. Cruel, dismissive laughter. She lowered the weapon, expression neutral, body language neither proud nor ashamed, a shadow among brighter flames. Colonel Thomas Bradley stepped forward, satisfied. His voice rolled across the range like an actor delivering his final line. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we've just witnessed an important lesson. Combat warriors fight. Support personnel support. Let's not confuse the two." It was theater, carefully staged humiliation. Nicole knew the script. She was meant to be the example of failure. The girl who couldn't hit a target at 50 yards. The invisible clerk whose only place was in a supply room, counting rounds for the men who carried them. And she played her part perfectly, until the silence broke. Sergeant Diane Foster didn't dismiss the firing line. She didn't laugh. She didn't even move at first. She just kept staring, eyes narrowing past the targets, past the wooden frames, out to the concrete backstop. Then she walked. Slow, deliberate steps across the gravel, her boots crunching against the silence until she reached the far wall. She raised her hand, touched the concrete and froze. Everyone waited. Bradley's irritation grew. "Sergeant, what is the problem?" Her voice carried like thunder. "Sir, you need to check the back wall." That single sentence killed the laughter. A ripple of confusion spread through the trainees. Even the cocky ones lowered their binoculars, unsure. Foster stepped aside, and that's when they saw it. 5 holes, not scattered, not random, tight, clean, precise, grouped tighter than a quarter. Not on the paper, not anywhere near the silhouette. No, threaded through a gap barely wide enough to slip a pencil through, hidden where no one could see. Nicole Harper hadn't missed at all. She had been hitting a target none of them could even imagine. For a heartbeat, nobody spoke. Then the whispers started. "That's impossible. No way she did that on purpose." Through the frame 5 times. Foster's eyes lifted, meeting Nicole across the valley. And for just an instant, Nicole let the mask slip. Not much, just enough. A flicker of acknowledgement, a warning, a truth no one wanted to see. Colonel Bradley's confidence cracked. He strode downrange with clipped anger, trailed by officers and trainees alike. He wanted proof. He wanted an explanation that fit his worldview, but there was no explaining those holes in the wall. Captain Brian Webb, intelligence background written in the sharpness of his gaze, studied both the concrete and the quiet woman who stood with folded hands, rifle slung as if it weighed nothing. He didn't laugh. He didn't doubt. He calculated. Nicole stood still, unreadable, as the colonel's theater collapsed around him. But inside was something different. 7 years of silence. 7 years of survival. 7 years of wearing the skin of someone ordinary, someone forgettable, someone who never stood out. And now, with 5 shots, it was all unraveling. She hadn't wanted this. Not here. Not yet. But when Bradley forced her hand, when he paraded her onto that range as a prop, she'd made a choice. To remind the world, remind the watchers that she was still here. Because she had seen the glint in the tree line, binoculars or a scope, watching from beyond the perimeter. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone waiting for a signal. Those 5 shots weren't just survival, they were a message. But a message once sent cannot be recalled. As the crowd murmured and the colonel sputtered, Nicole felt the air shift. Invisible no longer. Questions were coming. Investigations. Suspicions. And worse, the watchers outside the fence now knew she hadn't disappeared. The name she had buried, Sarah Phoenix, was stirring like ash caught in the wind. Nicole let out a slow breath. Neutral mask restored. She was still the quiet logistics clerk. She would be until she couldn't be anymore. But deep down she knew the truth. This was only the beginning. What happens when invisibility fails? Nicole Harper asked herself that question as the group shuffled back from the range. The colonel's face was tight with irritation, his authority cracked but not broken. Around him, the combat trainees whispered to each other, disbelief giving way to something sharper. Curiosity, suspicion, fear. That was worse than laughter. She had survived 6 months at Fort Ironwood by being nobody. The clerk who arrived early, did her job, left without complaint. The woman whose face blurred into the background, whose name didn't linger in memory. For half a year it had worked, and then 5 bullets tore that mask away. Colonel Bradley called the exercise to a halt with clipped efficiency, pretending it was about equipment checks and ammunition quality. But Nicole saw the anger in his jaw, the wounded pride in his eyes. He had staged this demonstration to prove a point, that people like her didn't belong on the firing line. Instead, she had shattered it. And men like him never forgave humiliation. Back in the logistics office, the air was different. Conversations hushed when she entered. Eyes lingered longer than before. Private Bennett, the youngest, avoided her gaze entirely, while Corporal Mitchell looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Specialist Patterson just stared, puzzled, as though trying to do the math of something that didn't add up. Nicole sat at her desk, updated supply logs, and pretended none of it touched her. But inside, the clock was ticking. She had sent a message, and messages always drew replies. The reply came faster than she expected. Harper. She looked up. Captain Webb stood in the doorway. His posture was casual, but his eyes were anything but. He had the look of a man who carried more secrets than he spoke. My office, 30 minutes. It wasn't a request. When he left, Mitchell leaned across her desk, lowering her voice. What did you do out there? Nicole typed another line into the inventory system. I fired 5 rounds. That's not what I meant. Everyone saw or didn't see. And Foster, Mitchell broke off, glancing at the others. You don't shoot like that by accident. Nicole's fingers stilled on the keyboard for just a second, then resumed. Paperwork doesn't file itself, Corporal. It was dismissal wrapped in neutrality, but the question lingered. What did you do out there? By the time Nicole reached Building 12, she had already rehearsed her answers. Not lies, not exactly, just truths trimmed down to fit inside walls of classification. She used them before. She'd use them again. Webb's office smelled faintly of coffee and dust, sparse, secure, the kind of room designed to keep secrets. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. Nicole complied, posture relaxed but alert, hands folded, eyes steady. Your personnel file, Webb began, is full of gaps. Nicole said nothing. Silence was often the safest response. No unit designation for your previous assignment. Medical records sealed above my clearance. Clearance levels redacted. That's unusual for a logistics clerk. Still, she didn't react. He leaned back, studying her. Most clerks don't put 5 rounds through a 2mm gap at 80 yards. She let out a quiet breath. The laws of physics weren't violated, sir. Ballistics is math, given the right conditions. Given the right training. The interruption was sharp, precise. Webb's eyes bored into hers. Training that doesn't show up in your file. For the first time, Nicole met his gaze fully. Calm, controlled, neutral. I fired 5 rounds at a designated target. Where they impacted is a matter of trajectory. It was the kind of answer designed to satisfy without revealing. The kind of answer only someone who had been trained in interrogation survival would give. Webb recognized it instantly. His mouth curved, not into a smile but into acknowledgement. "You're good, I'll give you that." Silence stretched, the kind that wasn't empty but heavy, layered with unspoken truths. Finally, Webb reached into his desk drawer and set a manila folder on the table between them. Thick, sealed, waiting. "This," he said, "is either the start of an official investigation or it stays between us. That depends on how you answer one question." Nicole's pulse remained steady, her breathing calm, but inside she felt the shift. One question could unravel everything. "Why," Webb asked softly, "is someone like you working logistics at a training base in Wyoming?" For the briefest second, the room felt smaller, the walls closer. Nicole lowered her eyes to the folder. She had survived 7 years by being invisible, by burying Sarah Phoenix and wearing Nicole Harper like a second skin, by erasing one life to protect another. And now, with one question, it was all at risk. She chose her words carefully. Sometimes assignments don't reflect the full scope of a soldier's background. Webb leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Go on." "Sometimes," she continued, "operational security requires certain compromises, appearances that don't align with reality." It was just enough, a breadcrumb of truth without opening the door fully. Webb studied her for a long moment, then sat back. "You're not running logistics." His voice was low, almost certain. "You're hiding." Nicole didn't flinch, didn't confirm, didn't deny. She simply let the silence answer for her. The captain tapped the folder once with his finger. "Whatever you are, Harper, you sent a message today, and messages get answered. You'd better be ready when they do." When Nicole left Building 12, the sun was setting over the Wyoming hills, the sky burning with color. Soldiers passed her on the walkways, laughing, talking, unaware of the storm that was forming. She walked as she always did, neutral pace, neutral posture, but inside her mind was already in survival mode, scanning, calculating, waiting. Because she knew Webb was right. The message had been received, and the reply was already on its way. Why was Master Sergeant Riley waiting at her desk? Nicole stopped in the doorway of the logistics office the next morning, masking the flicker of alertness in her eyes. Riley wasn't a man who loitered. Special operations background written in the scars around his knuckles, in the economy of his movements, in the way he carried himself like every corridor was an ambush point. He wasn't here for small talk. "Morning, Harper." His voice was even, but his posture was all wrong. He'd placed himself between her and the primary exit, casual enough to pass for coincidence, deliberate enough to remind her he had options. "Good morning, Sergeant." She crossed to her desk with unhurried steps. "Something I can help you with." Riley gestured toward her computer monitor. Inventory logs, her logs, interesting reading material. Nicole's breath paused in her chest just for a fraction of a beat. He'd been digging, watching. She lowered herself into the chair, her face calm. Routine tracking, supply requests, equipment distributions, standard work. "Standard," Riley leaned closer, scanning the screen. "Encrypted comms gear, advanced trauma kits, lock bypass tools. Doesn't strike me as standard for a training base." Nicole typed a few keys, pulled up another log, made the display look busy. "Compliance checks. Every request goes through us. It's my job to notice irregularities." His eyes finally met hers, and in them she saw it, not suspicion alone but recognition. "Patterns," he said. "I've seen them before. Quiet orders, piecemeal acquisitions, nothing that trips alarms until you map the whole picture. That's operational prep, Harper. Someone's building for something." Nicole held his gaze. Neutral, careful, but her pulse quickened because he was right. She'd seen it too. "Are you suggesting unauthorized activity on this base?" she asked softly. I'm suggesting, Riley replied, that someone's hiding behind logistics logs and that you noticed because you've been looking. That was the danger. He wasn't just suspicious, he was observant, too observant. Nicole turned back to the monitor, her tone flat. I'm thorough, that's all. Riley chuckled once. No humor. Thorough. Harper, your access logs show cross-references to catalogs most clerks don't even know exist. Either you're the most obsessive supply officer in Army history, or you're analyzing this for reasons you're not admitting. She stilled, hands resting lightly on the keyboard. He had her. Her training whispered in her ear, deflect, redirect, never confirm. But something in Riley's eyes told her he wasn't the enemy. Not yet. What conclusions have you drawn, Sergeant? That you're not who you say you are, and that you're paying attention to the same things I am. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Then Riley leaned back, giving her space but not letting go. 3 weeks ago, I was contacted by people claiming to represent an agency that doesn't show up on organizational charts. They asked if I'd seen personnel here with unusual skill sets, capabilities that didn't fit their paperwork. At the time, I said no, but yesterday changed that. Nicole's fingers curled, nails digging lightly into her palm under the desk. Her suspicions hardened. The glint in the tree line, the tampering with her past. It wasn't paranoia, it was pursuit. What did they want? She asked. Names, locations, descriptions. Riley's voice dropped lower. And Harper, they already knew more about this base than anyone outside should. Someone's feeding them, someone with reach. Nicole exhaled slowly, keeping her tone even. So why tell me? Because I think they're looking for you. The words landed like a hammer. Not shouted, not dramatic, just truth, plain and cold. Riley moved to the window, arms folded, staring toward the mountains. You don't flinch under pressure. You don't rattle. And when the colonel tried to humiliate you, you didn't just prove him wrong, you sent a signal to someone. Nicole said nothing, but her silence confirmed more than words ever could. He turned back to her. So here, where we stand, whoever's watching you has resources. They've already tapped me. They'll tap others. And sooner or later, they'll stop asking questions and start making moves. Her throat felt dry, but she kept her voice steady. And what do you want out of this, Sergeant? Information. Riley leaned against her desk, close enough that only she could hear. You know what you saw in those requests. You know what it means. We're both tracking the same threat. So either we keep circling each other, or we share intel before this place turns into something worse than a training ground. Nicole studied him. Years of survival screamed at her to shut down, to trust no one. Trust was the luxury of people who didn't carry ghosts. But Riley's words weren't idle. He put himself at risk admitting contact with outsiders. And if he was right, she was already compromised anyway. Her choice was narrowing by the hour. Before she could respond, the door banged open. Private K.H. Lowe Bennett, breathless, eyes wide. Sergeant Foster says she needs both of you at the range. Now, urgent. Nicole rose slowly, mind shifting gears. Riley pushed off the desk, his jaw tight. What kind of urgent? He asked. Bennett shook her head. She didn't say, just that it's about yesterday. Of course it was. The three of them walked in silence across the base, casual on the surface, but Nicole's senses burned. Every passing soldier could be watching. Every shadow could be listening. She kept her stride even, her posture relaxed, but her eyes scanned. Doorways, rooftops, reflections in glass. Survival never switched off. Thunder Ridge lay quiet when they arrived. Too quiet. Foster stood near the observation tower, her face grave. Beside her, Captain Webb, and Colonel Bradley, jaw clenched, shoulders rigid. But it wasn't their presence that froze Nicole's blood. Two strangers stood with them. Suits. Civilian clothes, but with the bearing of people who didn't need uniforms to carry authority. One man, one woman, both radiating the calm weight of federal power. Foster stepped forward, Harper, Riley, these agents have questions about yesterday's demonstration. The man spoke first. Agent Marcus Stone, FBI. This is Agent Lisa Kine. We're investigating potential security violations at this facility. Nicole felt the shift in the air, the tightening of the net. Federal jurisdiction. Questions she couldn't answer. Files she couldn't afford to have opened. She stood still, neutral mask in place, but inside. Inside, Sarah Phoenix was screaming. What happens when the mask is pulled too far? Nicole sat in the secure conference room of Building 12, the walls humming faintly with electromagnetic shielding, the kind that promised secrecy and threat in equal measure. Across the table, Agent Marcus Stone adjusted the recording device with methodical precision. His partner, Agent Lisa Kine, leafed through a manila folder so thick it seemed impossible that it referred to someone who had worked quietly in logistics for only 6 months. The sight of that folder sent a shiver through Nicole's chest. Too much paper, too much ink, too many pages that should not exist. "Miss Harper," Stone began, his voice steady but carrying weight. "For the record, state your full name, current assignment, and clearance level." Her voice was calm, practiced. "Nicole Marie Harper, Logistics Specialist, Fort Ironwood, Secret Clearance." Kine's eyes lifted from the file. "Is that your legal name?" Nicole felt her stomach tighten, but her face never changed. "That is the name reflected in my military records." "Military records can be amended," Kine pressed, her tone sharp. "We're asking about your legal identity." Nicole paused, not too long, just enough. "I have served under this name for my entire career." Stone leaned forward. "We have information suggesting otherwise, that you've used multiple identities, that your current presence here may be part of an infiltration." The word hung in the air like poison. "Infiltration by whom, Agent?" Nicole asked evenly. "Hostile intelligence services," Stone answered, almost casually, as though accusing a soldier of being a traitor were just another item on his morning checklist. Nicole's hands remained folded on the table. Her pulse beat slow, calm, deliberate. "I have never had contact with hostile intelligence services. I have never acted against the interests of the United States." Kine slid a photograph across the table. A woman in uniform stared back, younger, the insignia different. The name tag read Phoenix. The name struck like a blade. Staff Sergeant Sarah Elizabeth Phoenix, a name buried in rubble, declared dead, erased. "Do you recognize this woman?" Kine asked. Nicole studied the photo with the detachment of someone reviewing a stranger's file. "It appears to show a service member, but photographs can't confirm identity." "Facial recognition confirms it," Stone countered. "Bone structure, biometric analysis, 99.9% probability." Kine leaned forward. "You're Sarah Phoenix. You were reported killed in Syria in 2018. Nicole lifted her eyes, steady as stone. "I am Nicole Harper, Logistics Specialist." The dance continued. Push, deflect, push harder, deflect again. But then Stone struck differently. "If we've already proven you're Phoenix, the question isn't who you are, it's who helped you disappear." The air thickened. They weren't after her. They were after the network, the shadows that had carried her from one life to another, people who would vanish if she spoke their names, people who would die if she betrayed them. Nicole said nothing. Kine slammed the folder shut. "You understand this can go federal, prison, treason. We can pull every clearance, every connection. Or you can cooperate and maybe walk out of this with something left." Nicole's reply was soft, steady. "Then I'd like legal representation." Stone's jaw flexed. It wasn't anger, it was calculation. They hadn't wanted her to pull that card. Before he could press, the door opened. "Captain Webb, no knock, no hesitation. Agents, there's been an incident at the range." Kine bristled. "This is a federal interrogation." "Then you'll want to hear this," Webb shot back. The bullets from yesterday, someone removed them from the backstop, evidence tampered. That cut through the room like a blade. Stone rose instantly. Tampered by who? Unknown, Webb said. But Foster found tool marks, specialized extraction equipment. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. Kine and Stone exchanged a look, then gathered their folders. They'd come to prove Harper was a ghost. Instead, they now had a crime scene that didn't fit their script. As they filed out, Webb lingered, his eyes locking with Nicole, a subtle message. He hadn't done it to save her, not exactly, but to buy time. And time was worth more than oxygen. Minutes later, Nicole stood again at Thunder Ridge Range, flanked by FBI agents, Webb, Foster, Riley, and Colonel Bradley, whose face still burned with the desire to reclaim his authority. Foster pointed to the wall. The holes were larger now, edges marred, dust still clung to the concrete. Someone extracted them, she said grimly. Diamond-tipped variable-speed drills, not standard base issue. Riley's voice was low, thoughtful. Matches equipment orders I flagged last month. Bradley scoffed. So what? Maintenance contractors could have. No, Foster cut him off firm. This was surgical, purposeful. Stone crouched near the wall, fingers tracing the altered holes. Why erase proof of impossible marksmanship? The unspoken answer drifted in the silence. Because someone wanted her skill buried again, or stolen for themselves. Nicole's eyes flicked past the wall to the ridgeline, the same place she'd seen that glint. Whoever had been watching yesterday wasn't finished. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. It wasn't even about exposure. This was about control. And control meant one thing. She was now at the center of a game she hadn't chosen, with players willing to break into federal investigations and erase evidence to keep their hands hidden. Stone stood, brushing dust from his fingers. This isn't just about you anymore, Harper. Someone's running operations here, and until we find out who, no one leaves this untouched. Nicole kept her expression unreadable, but inside, she knew the truth Webb had warned her of. Messages always draw replies. And sometimes the reply isn't a voice. Sometimes it's a hand reaching into the dark, rewriting the story before you even know the ending. Why was a general flying into Fort Ironwood for a training accident? The question whispered across the base before the rotors even stopped turning. Soldiers lined the walkways, their chatter nervous as the Black Hawk settled onto the landing pad, its downdraft scattering dust like ash. Out stepped Major General Elias Murphy, grizzled, broad-shouldered, every inch of him carved from decades of command. Nicole watched from the periphery, standing among clerks and supply officers, face expressionless. But her mind burned with the implication. Generals didn't come for paperwork errors. They came when power was at stake. Murphy didn't waste time. Flanked by aides, he marched straight for the command building. The colonel trailed behind like a shadow stripped of substance, his earlier bravado reduced to nervous silence. Hours later, word filtered through the grapevine. The FBI had lost jurisdiction. Federal authority overridden. Whatever this was, it now belonged to the Department of Defense, and General Murphy was in charge. Nicole felt the walls closing in. By evening she was summoned, not requested, summoned. The conference room was colder this time, crowded with power. Murphy at the head of the table, Stone and Kine sidelined, Webb quiet and watchful, Foster standing rigid, Riley posted near the door like a sentinel. And in the center of it all, Nicole Harper. Murphy's eyes pinned her the moment she entered. At ease, specialist, sit. She obeyed, folding into the chair, posture relaxed but inner alarm screaming. The general clasped his hands. You've caused quite a stir. I fired at a target, sir. You didn't fire at a target, Murphy corrected, voice low but cutting. You performed a level of precision shooting that exceeds documented standards for anyone in this facility. Then the evidence disappeared. And then the FBI came sniffing around with a name we buried 7 years ago. He leaned forward. Tell me why Sarah Phoenix is sitting in my logistics office under the name Nicole Harper. Nicole kept her eyes steady, neutral mask in place. I don't know who Sarah Phoenix is, sir. Murphy chuckled once. It wasn't humor, it was warning. Don't insult me. I signed the death report myself. That admission hit like a stone. He wasn't guessing, he knew. Then perhaps there was a mistake, Nicole said softly. There was no mistake, Murphy shot back. You were extracted from Syria under black protocols. No body recovered. No funeral, no press. Officially, you ceased to exist, which worked just fine until yesterday when you decided to announce yourself with 5 perfect holes in a concrete wall. Silence stretched. No one moved. Even Bradley, once eager to gloat, sat rigid in the corner, his authority reduced to irrelevance. Murphy's voice dropped lower, quieter but heavier. Why now? Why show your hand? Nicole's reply was simple, deliberate. Because someone was watching. That shifted the air. Riley's eyes narrowed. Webb's jaw tightened. Foster leaned forward, interest sharpened. Murphy tapped a finger against the table. Explain. Nicole inhaled, steady. There was glass on the ridgeline, reflection, a scope. Binoculars, at least. Whoever it was, they weren't part of the exercise. Stone scoffed from the sideline. Paranoia, convenient excuse for exposure. But Webb's voice cut in, calm and precise. I believe her. I ran thermal sweeps afterward, got faint traces of heat signature. Someone was up there. Murphy nodded once, slow. So you knew you were compromised. Nicole didn't answer. She didn't need to. The general straightened. Here's the situation. You've been off the board for 7 years, but now the board knows you're back. Whoever been watching you won't stop, which means we can't leave you in a logistics office. You're a liability, a target. The words were iron, final. You're being transferred under my authority, Murphy declared. Effective immediately. You'll be placed in secure custody until we determine how deep this breach goes. Nicole felt the floor tilt beneath her. Secure custody, not freedom, not choice. A cage, even if it wore military colors. Sir, she began carefully, with respect, removing me from this environment only signals confirmation. Whoever's watching will know. They'll escalate. Murphy's gaze hardened. That's not your concern anymore. But it was. It always was. Because once you've been hunted, you never stop calculating the angles. Riley shifted near the door, his voice quiet but resolute. If you move her, you'd better double your security. Whoever's tracking her isn't amateur. They already infiltrated evidence control. Murphy acknowledged the point with a curt nod, which is why she'll be guarded. His eyes swung back to Nicole. And if you think you can vanish again, don't. Because if they don't find you first, I will. The meeting ended not with questions, but with orders. Nicole was escorted out under guard, every step echoing the slow erasure of the life she'd built. The quiet invisibility, the fragile safety, the borrowed name, all crumbling. That night she packed a duffel in silence. The logistics clerks who had once ignored her now watched from the doorway, whispers chasing her like shadows. Mitchell, Patterson, Bennett, faces caught between awe and fear. Mitchell finally spoke, voice low. You're not who we thought you were. Nicole paused, the duffel strap in her hand. Her answer was soft. Neither are most people. She walked past them without another word. At the airstrip, a transport plane waited. Engines cold, guards tense. Webb was there, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. You're not going to tell them, are you? Nicole asked quietly as they stood apart from the others. Webb tilted his head. Tell them what? That Phoenix is alive. He studied her. Officially, you're Harper, as long as I say so. Why protect me? She asked. His answer was flat. Because the people after you aren't stopping at you. They're after what you represent. And if they get it, we all lose. Before she could reply, Murphy's voice barked across the tarmac. "Load up, wheels up in 5. Nicole stepped onto the ramp, duffel slung, the weight of inevitability pressing down. The metal swallowed her, the interior dim and sterile. She strapped in, hands steady, heart heavy. Outside, the base lights blurred in the night air. Soldiers saluted as the engines roared, unaware that one of their own was being erased again. As the plane lifted into darkness, Nicole closed her eyes. She had buried Sarah Phoenix once. She had learned to live as Nicole Harper. And now they were burying her all over again, this time not in rubble but in chains of authority. But somewhere beyond the base, beyond the reach of generals and agents, the watchers waited. And they knew exactly who she was. Why did the sky itself seem to betray her? The transport smelled of oil and cold metal. The hum of the engines was a steady pulse, too steady, like a metronome counting down to something that had nothing to do with paperwork or official protocol. Nicole sat rigid in the hard seat, duffel tight under her knees, the strap of the seatbelt cutting across her chest, as if reminding her she was restrained in more ways than one. Outside the small window, the world blurred, Fort Ironwood shrinking into a patchwork of lights and dark. Inside, people moved with professional detachment, guards swapping observations in low voices, a nervous lieutenant staring at his tablet, an air of procedure masking anxiety. Captain Webb remained nearby, a careful shadow, his presence more shield than comfort. She tried to make her face ordinary, to be the clerk again, the one who counted rounds and checked manifests. It had worked once. It had bought her 6 months of quiet. But a plane is a small place and silence is an invitation. The questions, the examinations, they crowded in like smoke. The flight was meant to be simple: relocation to a secure processing facility, a few days of interviews, debriefings, and containment until the web of jurisdictions sorted itself. That was the story the generals and the agents wanted to sell. The truth, the one that existed in the muscles of her hands, was that simple plans invite complexity, and complexity is where people like her learn to survive. 2 hours into the flight, the plane jolted. A shudder, subtle at first, then violent, as if a hand had struck the belly of the aircraft. The cargo shifted. The lights flickered. Voices rose, sharp, clipped, rehearsed. Nicole's training woke like an old mechanism. She wasn't supposed to move. She wasn't supposed to panic. Yet every nerve in her body read the motion as something far more specific: a strike, a hit. The captain's calm voice came over the intercom, too calm, the wrong kind of practiced. "Maintain position. Crew is handling it." Translated, protocols. "Do not improvise. Tell the sheep to stay still while the wolves try the doors." Down the aisle, the lead guard cursed low and reached for a radio, his hands suddenly clumsy. Webb's jaw tightened. He rose, a motion that should have required permission, and moved toward the cockpit. The plane dipped. For a heartbeat, everyone looked at one another as if the answer might be found in someone else's eyes. Then a blast of static, then silence. The lights died altogether. In the black, something else moved, the soft sound of distant impact, then the metallic scream of something striking airframe. Weights shifted. A strobe flashed. And through the small porthole window, the world was not dark but streaked, tracer lines, brief luminous threads etching the night. The realization was immediate and cold. They were under fire. Panic is almost always louder than fear. It has a rhythm you can count on: sharp breaths, rapid footsteps, the rustle of equipment. But Nicole's reaction was not panic. It was a sequence she had practiced in other lives. Check for wind, locate the angle of approach, find cover, plan escape routes. On a plane, cover is abstract. Escape routes are limited. But thinking in limits is how you stay alive. The guards moved clumsily at first, then with trained efficiency. The lead guard barked orders in a voice sharpened by adrenaline. Webb drew his pistol and kept low, eyes scanning the fuselage. Someone worked to the rear ramp, flashing lights spilled in a jagged rectangle. The cargo door had been hit. The night air forced itself into the cabin in ragged gusts. cold, wet, full of distant sound. Nicole felt a dry crack in her throat and swallowed it down. Her hands went to the duffel, not to reach for weapons, there weren't any, but to make sure nothing was forgotten. Small things matter when time is measured in heartbeats. They tried to land. The pilot spoke in clipped bursts, asking for vectors, muttered coordinates. The plane groaned, a living thing in pain. "We're diverting," the pilot announced. "Emergency field, hold on." Outside, the world was a blur. The plane dropped like a stone, then found a flatness. The landing was rough enough to jolt teeth. The rear ramp flung open and cold air swept through like a blade. Men shouted, boots thudded against metal, and the transport's rear spilled out into a ring of lights and figures moving with the brittle precision of people at a practice drill. The escort that met them was not a welcoming committee. Night vision flicker, rifles raised, a scent of diesel and urgency. Men in plain uniforms, no insignia visible, moved like a second shadow. Someone shouted identification, someone else replied with a code. The scene felt like a staged intersection between military theater and clandestine operation. No one smiled. No one relaxed. Nicole's mouth tasted metallic. Her training crackled behind her ribs, a map of contingencies. She could have vanished then, the ramp, the night, the trees. But running into darkness without a plan is a hope, not survival. She stayed seated as ordered. She counted. They were marched into a darkened hangar under illumination that felt designed to disorient. Figures passed in the periphery, tall, broad, too purposeful. A man stepped forward, his face in shadow then suddenly visible, tall, surgical, with eyes that did not seek permission. He strode to the group and removed his gloves. "You are Nicole Harper?" he asked, voice even direct. "Yes," she said, voice steady. The word was a verification, brittle and necessary. "We have orders to take you into custody under General Murphy's authority," he said. "You will be processed at a secure location for debriefing." She'd heard that before. The line-sized words meant many things. It meant transport. It meant time. It meant others were making choices on her behalf. It meant the tempo of the hunt had increased. They moved her in a van, windows blacked, the world turned to smeared light. Webb rode a separate vehicle and caught her eye once, a flicker of something, concern perhaps, or calculation. He mouthed a single word: wait. Wait, it could mean stay silent, or prepare, or trust a man you had reason not to trust. Nicole let the ambiguity sit like a stone in her gut. The processing facility was not an air-conditioned office building. It was concrete, functional, spare, the kind of place built to deny comfort. They sat in a room of harsh light, men and women moving with precise bureaucracy. The lead agent introduced himself, style worn like armor. "Agent Stone," he said, "we'll take your statement now." The interrogation resumed, but the questions shifted. No longer was it about identity, it was about the night. "Who attacked the plane?" Stone asked. "How did they find you? Did you provoke them intentionally?" Nicole answered with the careful scalpel of someone who calculates words like ammunition. "We were struck mid-flight," she said. "Unknown source. Could have been ground-launched. Could have been an organized interception. The only thing certain is that they knew our vector and moved to intercept it." Stone's face tightened. "Does anyone have motive to attack this transport?" The answer was complex, muted, official sounding. Anyone who wanted to stop movement, create confusion, or more likely, draw specific persons into a controlled environment. The last phrase lingered like a shadow. Nicole had the unshakable sense they'd been herded, nudged with force into the hands of someone else. They questioned her about equipment orders, about the tampered backstop, about any enemies she may have made. She parried, exposing enough truth to look cooperative but not enough to give away the origins of her life as Sarah Phoenix. "Legal counsel," she repeated when asked about representation. The agents noted it without enthusiasm, the option of lawyers in a world where Murphy's intervention already modified the rules felt like a threadbare shield. At night, alone in a cell lit by a single bulb, Nicole let her hands remember other places. The cadence of loading a rifle, the smell of baked metal, the way bad light hides better than bright. Her thoughts were not of escape in that moment. They were of calculation. Of what could be done if the watchers were closer than anyone admitted. Of what would happen if the people who had supplied her new identity were still alive. Of the cost to them, to others, to the fragile piece she had carved out. Sleep did not come so much as drift, scattered images, fragments of faces, numbers, coordinates. A lullaby of a previous life hummed in her bones. She had trained for many things, but never for being found again. That, she decided, was a kind of cruel training. Morning brought contact. Webb again, this time not with orders but a caution. "They're not amateurs," he said low, voice nearly a whisper. "Whoever hit us had precision. Whoever tampered with the wall had reach. Whoever scrubbed the evidence has intent." "And what does intent look like?" she asked. He shrugged, a tiny, useless motion. "Control, ownership. If you were a piece on a board, someone wants to dictate how you move." Nicole let the words sink in. She had been taught to be a tool, a weapon, a ghost. But ownership is not the same as agency. The difference had teeth. Later that day, in the sterile light of the briefing room, the agents ran analysis on the attack. Satellite pings, radar blips, the curve of tracer entries. They offered possibilities but no definitive answer. Whoever struck the plane had planned for interception. Whoever altered the backstop had specialized tools. Whoever fed the FBI the name Sarah Phoenix had access to files that should have been burned. Her mind filled the gaps with worst-case possibilities, not because she preferred panic to peace, but because the worst case is the one you plan for. Every contingency she had been trained to imagine nested like Russian dolls. Each one revealed another threat inside. At some point, fatigue sank in. It was not sleep as much as a flattening of nerves. The room fogged, then cleared. She caught herself humming under her breath, a rhythm that had once been code, a small defiance that kept her human in a calculus of machines and men. That night, as she lay in a cot in a locked room with the hum of distant generators, a thought came soft and simple. People who cannot disappear again build anchors. They make themselves predictable to survive. They plant routines. They trust too little. They trust too much. It is a constant negotiation. Outside, beyond the concrete, somewhere in the dark, someone watched and waited. The plane incident had proven one thing. The watchers were not a rumor. They were real. They were close. And they had both motive and capability to change the rules on a dime. Nicole turned her face to the ceiling and let the weight of two names settle in her mouth. Nicole Harper, the woman who counted rounds, and Sarah Phoenix, the ghost they had once declared dead. Both names were truths. Neither offered shelter. She closed her eyes and let the silence teach her a new lesson. Being found is only the first step. The harder task is choosing how to answer when the world expects you to be afraid. Outside her window, a single light blinked in the distance, steady, methodical, like a heart monitoring a life in motion. It was a beacon, or a signal. She would know soon enough which. Why did she still imagine the sound of concrete cracking under her fingers? They had moved her like property, cataloged, numbered, reassigned. The facility called itself secure. The lights were bright and unforgiving. The guards wore expressions that accepted orders without question. Nicole lay on the thin mattress and listened to footsteps in the corridor above, counting them the way a nervous person counts beads. One for the man with the clipped gait, two for the woman with the soft shoes, three for the boots that never stopped. She learned their rhythms as a child learns a lullaby, by repetition, until the pattern is stitched into the mind. In the morning, they led her down long corridors that smelled of antiseptic and bureaucracy. The interrogation rooms here were quieter than the FBI's. No dramatic folders, no theater. Just a table, two chairs, and men who knew how to ask questions that left fingerprints on the soul. General Linda Murphy sat across from her like a verdict. Not anger, not curiosity, a kind of bureaucratic inevitability. The woman who had walked onto Fort Ironwood and taken jurisdiction had authority that tasted metallic. She folded her hands, palms down, as if to pin the conversation to the table. "Staff Sergeant Phoenix," she said, using the name that had been used against her. "You've already made this difficult for everyone involved." Nicole felt the old name slide through her like cold water. The sound of it carried the ghosts of other lives, missions folded under desert suns, comrades whose faces were now photographs in folders, decisions made in the dark that had mechanisms for staying dark. She could have corrected Murphy. She could have refused the name. But sometimes answers are weapons and sometimes silence is armor. "You can call me Nicole Harper," she replied. The words were small and steady. "It's the name I'm authorized to use." Murphy's eyes did not soften. "You were declared KIA 7 years ago. Bodies were never recovered. Your reappearance requires explanation. If you were extracted, if you were replaced, by whom? Who facilitated your disappearance?" The question was not about identity. It was about accountability. The department did not like loose ends. It preferred tidy stories with clear openings and closed arguments. Nicole had been a messy footnote in a classified ledger. Murphy wanted to know who had written it. "I don't know who you think helped me," Nicole said. "I know who I am now. That's the truth I can testify to." She could have told them the truth. Would it have changed anything? Names, locations, loyalties. They would rip them apart in rooms like this until the truth looked like a confession of things she could not undo. Murphy's gaze did not waver. "You sent a message on the range." The general tapped a thin file on the table. "That was deliberate." Nicole let the admission sit in the room. It was true and partial. "I did what I had to do," she said. "Someone was watching. I made sure they knew I hadn't disappeared." Murphy's hand curled slightly. "And what if your message was an invitation? What if those watching were not deterred but encouraged? Your actions have consequences beyond you, Staff Sergeant. They affect programs, assets, lives. People whose existence is predicated on secrecy." That sentence landed with the soft impact of falling glass. Nicole thought briefly of the network of favors, of the safety that came from being unseen. She thought of the faces she had buried. She thought of the men and women who'd built a life for her under other names. A truth settled over her. Once visibility returns, the ledger opens. People on both sides of it will be affected. "We can protect you under Special Access Program protocols," Murphy continued. "Temporary relocation, debriefings, containment while we conduct an investigation." The phrase contained the promise and the threat. Protection came at the cost of isolation. Nicole let the trade-off roll in her mouth. Protection meant loss of movement and autonomy. Containment might be safety, but it would also be a cage. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Murphy's mouth thinned. "Refusal does not change the trajectory of events. It only changes who decides your fate. Cooperation will expedite resolution. Resistance prolongs uncertainty. In other words, cooperate and you might keep some fragments of a life. Resist and they would take them for you." Outside the room, the world was rearranging itself. Agent Stone and Agent Kine huddled with analysts, faces lit by screens. Webb moved through the corridors like a man balancing plates, efficient, careful, carrying favors he may not have wanted. Master Sergeant Riley kept his distance, hands sometimes on his hips, sometimes in his pockets, as if measuring the room with his palms. Foster hovered near the edges, a sentinel who still trusted the sanctity of firearms more than the sanctity of protocol. They moved her again, this time not to a cell but to a processing suite that smelled faintly of coffee and burned paper. Her bag sat at the foot of the bed, folded clothes neat, as if someone had expected her to be absent too long. They asked the same questions in different voices. The same questions wear different faces. Who helped you? Do you have enemies? Are you a threat to national security? Each one like a coin flipped into a slot with the hope of buying an answer. Later, when the lights dimmed and the corridor settled into a scraped hush, Riley appeared at her door. He did not knock. He slid in as if the hinges expected him. Up close he looked smaller than in memory, older, more careful, like someone who'd learned caution from the scars in the world. "You shouldn't be here," he said, not a statement but a fact. "I shouldn't be anywhere right now," she answered. "Why are you here?" He sat on the chair, elbows on his knees. He looked tired, the kind of tired that years of operations leave you with, bone deep and precise. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about the supply orders." He pulled a small printout from his pocket and slid it across the table. These came from 3 separate accounts, routed through shell requests and third-party vendors. No official mission, no authorized deployment. And this is the troubling part. Most of the shipments arrived on nights when maintenance crews were scheduled elsewhere. She ran her finger over the numbers. She'd seen that pattern before, careful, deliberate, designed to keep footprints faint. You think someone building operational capability on the base without telling command, she said. "I think someone's building something and using base channels to cover it up." He met her gaze. "And I think someone high up is comfortable with it." Her chest tightened. "You mean this is sanctioned?" "I don't know," he said, "but the pattern looks familiar. The procurement requests are coded in a way reserved for special access programs. Same kind of language, same kinds of justifications. Whoever's doing this knows how to hide details in plain sight." Nicole's mind cataloged the implications. Programs that live behind need-to-know walls have their own logic: deniability, necessity, control. People like Murphy and the shadowed figures had been protecting programs that sometimes required messes and sometimes created them. "You're here to help?" she asked finally. Riley hesitated. "I'm here because I have questions and you might have answers. You're also here because someone asked me to keep an eye on you, not because they trust you, because they think you might be a variable." The word variable sat in the room like a stone. It meant she was an unknown factor in a model people were trying to stabilize. "What do you want?" she asked. He leaned in. "Information, your read on the base. Who orders what, who's been working nights. Little things, people you think are odd, anything that might link the supply trails to faces." Nicole considered the offer. The old Emily, the Sarah Phoenix who trusted no one, would have refused. Information is power, and power can burn those who handle it lightly. But the new calculation, one formed by months of being anonymous, then weeks of being hunted, shifted the scale. She knew how to give answers without handing over lives. She also knew the cost of silence. "Okay," she said, "but if I do this, you're not going to sell me out to Murphy. You keep your word." Riley's jaw tightened. "I give you my word." Trust, she thought, was a transaction. It required currency, risk on one side, reciprocity on the other. She counted. The numbers balanced. Over the next days, the interrogation theater grew. Analysts churned through manifests and voice prints. Murphy convened panels. Stone's team traced metadata. Whoever the watchers were, they had not been idle. New anomalies appeared. A contractor manifest bearing a familiar signature that had been scrubbed from the ledger. A maintenance crew whose time logs matched nights when specialized tools were requisitioned. A vendor payment routed through a defense contractor with a shell company address in a state 3,000 miles away. Nicole fed Riley what she could. Little notes, an eyebrow at a name, a memory of a face in a vendor lunchroom. Each data point felt like a pebble dropped into a pond. The ripples reached surfaces she could not see. By then, the base had a new cadence. Conversations were tight, staccato. People who once shared jokes now held them close, wary of listening devices. Bradley fumed in quieter corners, his authority undermined by forces he could not name. Webb moved like a shadow with a bargain tucked under his arm. Foster watched weapons like scripture. Murphy watched everything like someone reading a ledger and deciding which entries to black out. Late one night, when the facilities hummed thin to the whisper of generators and the cameras blinked in their little nocturnal heartbeats, Riley slipped a folded note under her door. Her name in block print: Meet, Rooftop, 0200. She read it twice, her pulse measured it, then she folded it back and put it in her pocket. On the rooftop, the wind cut like paper. The stars were cold, indifferent pinpricks. Riley was there, silhouette against the night, and for a moment their faces were not the faces of soldiers, but of people who had once chosen a life where every second might be the last. "You sure about this?" he asked. She breathed in. The air tasted like metal and possibility. "No," she said, "but I'm tired of being moved like freight." He offered a hand. "If we do anything, we plan, we don't improvise." She took his hand. It was warm, human. It held a promise, not salvation but company. Below them, the base blinked. Somewhere out there, the watchers moved in patterns she couldn't predict. Somewhere, someone was deciding what her life meant to them and whether it should continue. She had two names to choose from and neither gave shelter. But she had eyes. She had hands. She had people who might, if the numbers shifted right, tilt a scale. The moral tasted bitter and true. Survival rarely asks for permission. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. They stayed a moment longer on the rooftop, not making plans as much as gathering courage. The night did not promise safety. It promised only possibility. And when you are invisible for so long, possibility is dangerous company. Below, a light blinked on a camera, steady as a heartbeat. Above, a satellite passed, tiny, cold, and precise. The watcher moved. The game advanced. They had set the board. Now they would see who made the first mistake. Who would decide which life she deserved to keep. The question sat heavier than the concrete around them. Night had thinned into a pre-dawn bruise, the base settling into a brittle quiet that sounded to Nicole like waiting. She and Riley had stitched a plan from fragments: supply room cover, vendor manifests, a maintenance crew with access after hours, a contractor whose badge never scanned the same twice. Small things. Little lies that, when woven together, might map the architecture of whatever Shadow had been building beneath Fort Ironwood. They moved with the economy of people who had practiced silence. Riley coordinated with two contacts, quiet, reliable. Foster agreed to a watch post that kept her standard of weapons sanctity while contributing real muscle. Webb provided a paper trail that looked like oversight. His favors bought access where rank alone could not. They were a ragged coalition. A logistics clerk who knew barcodes, a master sergeant with old debts, an intelligence officer who favored quiet interventions, and a range master who still believed something like honor mattered in a world of cover-ups. They started at the maintenance yard. The manifest stitched by Riley's contacts showed a shipment last month. Diamond-tipped drills, variable-speed rigs, extraction tools, all routed through a shell company that had the decency to vanish the day after. The paperwork had been sanitized, the signatures forged with skill. But the drills themselves had a serial number that matched a ledger entry kept, for reasons unknown, in a contractor's pocket. A weak thread. But they'd learned to follow weak threads until they led somewhere warm. Nicole moved like a shadow among the workers. She had the credentials to be there, at least on paper, and the posture to look unremarkable. They watched her, hands busy, eyes trained on tasks. No one questioned the woman cataloging bolts and cross-referencing part numbers. That was her camouflage. Ordinariness made ordinary people forget to look deeper. Riley and Foster slipped among the stacks, their movements quiet. Webb intercepted the contractor who'd signed for the shipment, a man with oily hair and hands that never seemed clean. Webb's conversation was polite, layered with the authority of someone who could make life easier or harder with a phone call. The contractor's answers were practiced. He'd been briefed. He was small in the face of consequences, but not without fear. Behind a shed, in the hollow light of a work lamp, Nicole watched the man, felt the tide of something ancient and sharp. She pressed her palm to the paper list and memorized numbers until they were a map in her head. The drills had been used. The backstop had been opened. Bullets removed. Evidence altered. Whoever had signed for those tools had a role, and those roles often have names. They traced the contractor to a vendor who, when pressed, coughed up a bank transfer, an innocuous wire through a defense subcontractor. The subcontractor's name mattered less than the routing, a shell that funneled money through 3 states, finally landing in an account owned under a nonprofit that, on paper, supported veteran services. The nonprofit was clean enough to be plausible, dirty enough to be a perfect cover. People were good at hiding under the language of service. Riley leaned over the ledger and tapped a date. Maintenance logs show crew A out at 200 that night. Crew B shows a hole at 300. No one recorded the contractor's presence. He looked up at Nicole. Someone made sure the logs didn't reflect the timeline. Nicole tasted salt. Anger is a precise instrument when you let it be. She placed her hand on the ledge and felt the cold metal. Who benefits? She asked. Someone who wanted the wall cleaned, Webb said. Someone who didn't want evidence, or someone who needed a narrative changed. He left the unsaid hanging between them. They followed the trail further until the path forked. On one side, procurement requests coded under special access. On the other, a name that surfaced again and again in supplier lists, an analyst who'd been transferred off the books years ago and reappeared at the precise moments the tools vanished. The analyst's file was thin. His presence had the careful quality of a ghost that bureaucrats prefer, visible only when it's useful. They moved to confront him in a cubicle that smelled of burnt coffee. He was smaller in person, mid-40s, hairline receding, eyes like a man who had learned to hide behind spreadsheets. "You're a curious man," Nicole said, voice low. He blinked. "I'm just a contractor." "Keep telling yourself that," Riley said. "Why move equipment at night? Why extract bullets from a base backstop?" The contractor's hands trembled. The story spilled, not a confession so much as an unraveling. Payments routed from a fund that answered to channels that answered to programs with names that couldn't be said in open rooms. The analyst's voice dropped when he mentioned a liaison who visited in civvies, a tall woman who signed files and never once asked about chain of command. Names that evaded jurisdiction. Nicole listened, watched his manner unspool into fear. People who hide networks fear 2 things, exposure and retribution. He feared the first more than the second. You can threaten the former, the latter requires action. He'd been careful. He'd been sloppy. He had family, an apartment, a phone with a voicemail, small betrays. They left him in a quiet office with 2 men who knew how to persuade accountants to take different courses. The trail had not become a rope, yet, but it had knots. Back at the processing facility, they stitched together the knots like a surgeon attempting to see the body beneath the skin. Names connected. A vendor, a nonprofit, a contractor, a liaison. Each step deeper pulled at threads stitched by people with authority to erase. The moral of classified work. The higher the clearance, the more likely someone will assume ownership of truth. Murphy's presence altered the air. He convened panels that felt like tribunals. Stone and Kine watched with the caution of 2 professionals who had been shown the limits of their jurisdiction. Bradley paced like a man balancing between pride and humiliation. The more they uncovered, the more the ledger revealed its margins. Entries with names replaced, payments rerouted, maintenance crews reassigned. The fingerprints were faint but consistent. You can follow patterns until they form a face. Sometimes they form a government. Sometimes they form a person. The person here was obvious enough. A program manager who had been reassigned from theater-level logistics to a role that intermingled with civilian contractors. His file showed a promotion, a commendation, a set of memoranda signed in a hand that had authority. He'd answered to a chain that twisted through defense channels into the White House, names you don't whisper unless you want rooms to empty. Nicole read the file and felt a weary rage she'd learned to mask. People wielded institutions like blunt instruments, and when institutions hid misdeeds, the misdeeds hardened into policy. They brought the program manager in. His office smelled of lemon cleaner and success. He sat with the arrogance of a man who knows the shields he wears. "Miss Harper," he said pleasantly, "We're trying to keep this professional." "You had men drilling into concrete at night," Nicole said. "You removed evidence. You lied to Joe in procurement." He smiled. "All actions in the interest of national security require discretion." "Whose security?" Nicole asked. "Whose interest is more important than the truth on a wall where 5 rounds went through a 2-millimeter gap?" His smile tightened. "You're emotional. That's understandable given your unique background, but discretion keeps assets safe. Sometimes pieces are moved for reasons that remain classified." Riley's patience thinned. "You endangered a lot of people." The manager's face hardened. He rose, calm as a judge. "We do what the program requires. If you can't accept that, then you're the one who's in the wrong place." It was the old elite defense. Hide actions behind necessity. The moral argument of bureaucracy. Ends justify the means so long as the means remain hidden. Nicole tasted the sourness of it and found it bitter. People did not survive in the gray without leaving wounds. The confrontation ended with no arrests. The manager had the authority to reroute the inquiry. Murphy let them chase procurement threads but kept the manager close. There are places you can't push without shaking an entire edifice. But every edifice has seams. They found one, a server farm, an off-site storage unit for logs that had been archived. Riley and Webb worked through cold nights, fingers tracing IPs, VPN tunnels into cloud archives. They unearthed records scrubbed from the base, timestamps adjusted, files masked, a list of operations with redactions so thick you could not see the ink beneath. Among those redactions were references to a program designed to create plausible deniability for certain operations meant to be untraceable. When they presented the evidence, Murphy's face did not display surprise. He displayed calculation. Power does not tremble at revelation. It calculates an acceptable loss. "Some secrets are necessary," he said finally. "We will not allow them to fall into the hands of our adversaries." Nicole's mouth was dry. "Is the truth only inconvenient to you when it's inconvenient to protect?" The general's jaw moved. "We protect what must be protected." The moral argument returned, yours versus mine, stacked against the notion of safety. Nicole had been trained to accept some kinds of necessary secrets. What she could not accept was a program that blurred into impunity, where men used the language of security to cover personal ambitions. They had evidence enough to rattle boards but not enough to topple them. The government does not collapse by virtue of truth alone. It collapses when enough people decide to let it. That decision is slow, public, and mostly bureaucratic. It requires votes, hearings, press, people who will risk exposure for outcomes not guaranteed. They had courage. They did not have the levers. So they made a different choice. On a rooftop under a tremulous sky, Nicole and Riley and a handful of others convened. The sun was not yet up. The world smelled of cold steel. They had a plan. Not to expose the entire program to a public that would either ignore it or swallow it, but to protect the parts that mattered, the lives at risk, the names that would be hunted if the ledger opened. Nicole made the decision everyone felt but few would voice. She would step into visibility on her own terms, pull the cloak of anonymity not to vanish, but to redirect attention. She would use herself as a decoy if needed to keep the network that had hidden her safe. She would create a narrative that satisfied enough questions to close some doors and open others in ways that protected lives she could not afford to endanger. Riley looked at her like a man watching a friend walk a razor. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. She smiled, not warmth but a kind of sad clarity. "I never did." They moved, planting documents that revealed enough to satisfy bureaucrats but not enough to end lives, leaking a trace that shifted the hunt, using legal protections to create barriers, ensuring that if investigators dug, they found a maze that protected the names that mattered. It was not clean. It was not perfect. But it was a net, messy, human, effective. When the dust settled months later, hearings had occurred. Men who once thought themselves untouchable found themselves reassigned. Programs were audited with the fanfare of oversight. The manager was disciplined and quietly transferred to a satellite post. Murphy retained his authority but learned the contours of a world that no longer bowed to secrecy without consequence. Nicole's life did not return to the quiet she had loved. She did not vanish again. She accepted an arrangement that balanced protection with autonomy, placed under a program that recognized her value, given a role that matched her skill, but tethered with enough oversight that the watchers could not claim her as property. She stood once more at a range, older eyes reading the horizon. The backstop still bore faint scars, a memory of 5 holes threaded through a seam that had once hidden truth. She touched the concrete lightly with a gloved hand, feeling the roughness of it, the residue of decisions that belonged to others as much as to her. People asked her later if she regretted the choices, the reveal, the bargains, the lives rearranged to keep the network safe. She thought of quiet rooms, of faces under low light, of the contractor whose hands had trembled. She thought of Webb's warning and Riley's hand. She thought of Foster standing guard, of Bradley's and Murphy's, of Stone and Kine forced to learn the limits of their reach. In the end, she answered the only way she could, with the small truth she'd rehearsed for years beneath different skis. "I did what I had to do," she said. "Not for glory, not for punishment, for the people left in the spaces between official lines." The narrator in a voiceover would say it then, soft, grave, the cadence of a life hard one. Sometimes the world asks us to choose between being seen and being safe. Sometimes it asks us to decide who gets to name us and who gets to keep those names alive. Nicole looked at the range, then up at the ridgeline where the watchers once glinted. There were no more glints. There were fewer questions. There were still unknowns. But she had made a calculation. Visibility for protection, truth for survival, sacrifice for others who could not speak for themselves. She had loved anonymity because it let her breathe. She had learned to prefer action because it let others live. The ledger had not closed. It had been rewritten in margins that mattered. And there, where the concrete held the faint memory of 5 impossible holes, she left a message not of defiance, but of quiet, hard dignity. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.